This program is brought to you by the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies. This lecture is one in a series exploring the message of the Book of Mormon and its invitation to everyone to come unto Christ. The speaker is Richard L. Anderson. The title of this lecture is Testimonies of the Three Witnesses.
For over 40 years, I've been a student of Joseph Smith's life and teachings, and I've experienced what those close to him reported. They felt God's power as he privately and publicly taught. They learned the full meaning of Bible verses ignored by traditional Christians. They had full confidence that as a prophet, Joseph Smith was in touch with God and powerfully brought those hearing him closer to Christ. He translated an ancient book, the Book of Mormon, from metal plates, and this was a record of Christ's American ministry. Now, this modern prophet offers evidence of his divine calling that I find nowhere but in the Scriptures. I hold a fine facsimile of the Book of Mormon in my hand, and it relies on not only the record of the ancient people, but at the back of the book is published in the original edition the testimony of 3 witnesses and then the testimony of 8 witnesses. I first came in touch with the concept of witnesses in law school as I learned that in property transactions and in some cases wills that you needed 2 or 3 witnesses to attest to the signature. And then as I proceeded in graduate school in history, I learned that all history is reconstructed from witnesses. And I feel that there is no religious leader that I know about in the contemporary scene or historically outside of the Bible that really deals with witnesses. And I have spent a good deal of my life trying to identify the lives and the testimonies of these 11 men who said they saw the plates and said they saw the angel when the Book of Mormon was ready to be published. Their stories are remarkable. Their lives went in different directions, but there was the common denominator that they had seen a thing which changed their lives. In my life, I've heard scores of questions about these witnesses, and I would like to construct a summary of their testimony from the questions that are really asked as people think about this. Does God need witnesses? Perhaps he doesn't, but as humans, we need a basis of our faith. He furnishes evidence if we will listen. What is God's law of witnesses? This is not very well understood as a religious concept, but God has never given a revelation from his courts to this earth without sending more than one witness. He attests or backs up the persons that he sends. Now you think of Moses' day, there was Aaron to be a second witness to Pharaoh and to the Egyptian courts, and to all of us as we read the book of Exodus today. You think of Christ, a second witness came, John the Baptist, and Jesus said he was a burning and a shining light, and Jesus relied upon his testimony in testifying of his own mission. You think of the resurrection. It didn't happen in some out-of-the-way place with nobody seeing it. There were 12 men who saw the resurrection, and then other witnesses that are reported in the New Testament. So the concept of witnesses is critical as we examine God's work. Why doesn't God make all people witnesses? Well, Latter-day Saints have an insight into that. We feel through revelation that life is a place of proving, and that as we come into this earth, we need to exercise our faith and grow and learn through searching and seeking. So I would like to read what Peter said on that subject. In the 10th chapter of the book of Acts, Peter was explaining his position as a Christian to a person who had sent for him, Cornelius, a very well-to-do and well-placed Roman centurion. And Peter said in Acts 10 and 40 that God raised up Christ and showed him openly, but not to all people, but unto us who are witnesses chosen before of God, who did eat and drink with him after he rose from the dead. So just as there are witnesses of the resurrection in the Bible, God has provided witnesses in the modern day for the ancient record of Christ and his resurrection on the American continent. What does the Book of Mormon say about witnesses? This is fascinating because as the scribes of Joseph Smith sat and took dictation, they heard these very words. And I'm reading from Ether in the Book of Mormon, chapter 5, verses 2 through 4. And this is addressed by the ancient writer to the modern translator. Behold, you may be privileged that you may show the plates unto those who shall assist to bring forth this work. And unto three shall they be shown by the power of God. Wherefore they shall know of a surety that these things are true. And in the mouth of three witnesses shall these things be established. And the testimony of three and this work in which shall be shown forth the power of God, all this shall stand as a testimony against the world at the last day. Now, what's so interesting about that verse is that you have the three separated from no designation of others who may assist to bring forth the work. So Joseph Smith showed the plates to 3 individuals and to 8 individuals, a total of 11, and theirs is the testimony, but the 3 had a supernatural vision, and that is why the Book of Mormon says they saw this by the power of God. Why are there 2 sets of witnesses? As you look at the fly leaf now of the Book of Mormon, we put that testimony from the back of the book to the front. Well, the 3 witnesses said they saw the plates and an angel, and the 8 witnesses simply said they felt the plates, they handled them, they lifted them. And if you say, well, Joseph Smith perhaps had made a set of plates so people could examine something physical, that doesn't explain the idea that the angel from God came with supernatural power and glory. And so you know by the testimony of the 3 witnesses the supernatural reality of the book, God's will in giving it. And then there are those, especially in our day, who would say, well, maybe Joseph Smith just got people emotionally excited. That's what this vision amounts to. Well, if you say that, what about the physical evidence of the plates, which weighed between 40 and 60 pounds and could be described in detail? And so you have the physical and the spiritual mutually complementary when you see the testimony of the 3 and the 8 witnesses. Does their close relationship invalidate their testimony? This is interesting because the witnesses of the Book of Mormon who signed that they had hefted or lifted the plates are 3 from the Smith family and 5 from the Whitmer family, including one brother-in-law, Hiram Page. The testimony of the 3 witnesses doesn't fall quite into that category. But as you look at the Bible and the resurrection witnesses, the 12 who saw Christ in the resurrection, there are several sets of brothers. Some are related to Christ. And when you really think of the process of translating the Book of Mormon, it took place under the surveillance of people in a fairly compact household. In the 19th century, privacy was not really the same thing as it is today in quality homes. So people lived shoulder to shoulder, more together, and the women and the men of both households watched this translation process, the Smiths and then the Whitmer household, where the Book of Mormon was finally finished in its translation. And to a man and to a woman, everybody in those households was convinced, and it was from these people that had helped to bring forth the work that the witnesses were selected. What did the 3 witnesses do to qualify for their supernatural experience? Now, these were people in the Whitmer and Smith households, plus Martin Harris, who had a special relationship to the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Martin Harris was a very prominent farmer in Palmyra, New York, and originally he had contacted Joseph Smith, learning about the discovery of the plates of the Book of Mormon, And he had given him $50 to help move away from Palmyra, where there was persecution, to the Pennsylvania location where Joseph Smith began his first translation of the Book of Mormon. And then in the summer of 1828, Martin Harris went to Pennsylvania and spent almost 3 months writing the translation of the Book of Mormon. Unfortunately, that work product was lost, but Martin Harris already, because he was a man of maturity, was an individual with a farm, and he was willing to finance the Book of Mormon, and that was planned. And so Martin Harris had that special relationship of assisting from the beginning and being prospectively the financier for the Book of Mormon. Then Oliver Cowdery came onto the scene in the next summer, and he was the effective scribe for the present Book of Mormon. Oliver Cowdery was the village school teacher, and he boarded in various houses in the community of Manchester and Palmyra, where Joseph Smith's parents lived. Now, Joseph Smith was away at this time. He was married and lived in Pennsylvania, and Oliver Cowdery began to hear about the experiences of Joseph Smith. And of course, this was with a good deal of ridicule in the community, but he took it very seriously and received some very deep manifestations, came to Joseph Smith in the spring of 1829, and then wrote our entire present Book of Mormon as far as the original manuscript. Then the third person that was selected was David Whitmer. And David Whitmer, in a sense, represents a whole family, but his special contribution was investigating. Oliver Cowdery had been an acquaintance, and he said to Oliver Cowdery, when you go to Joseph Smith, would you be sure to let me know, send me information about this translation? And after the information that it was a sincere spiritual experience, a deep one, David Whitmer then got a letter from Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery saying, we need help, we need a place to be because persecution is arising in our area. And so David Whitmer brought the translators up to his home in Fayette, New York, in mid-New York, not very far away, 30 miles from Palmyra. And because of that special contribution, it was natural that he would be selected. How did those around Joseph Smith learn that there would be witnesses? Well, first of all, Martin Harris had a special revelation. This is section 5 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And in that special revelation, I'm going to read this in its original version as it first was written to Martin Harris. And the statement was given right at the outset of the translation of the Book of Mormon in very early 1829, somewhat to comfort Martin Harris because he no longer was the scribe, and Oliver Cowdery had not come on the scene. And the Lord said to Martin Harris, the testimony of 3 of my servants shall go forth with my words unto this generation. Yea, 3 shall know of a surety that these things are true. For I will give unto them power that they may behold and view these things as they are. And to none else will I grant this power to receive this same testimony among this generation. And so right at the outset, the promise was made in a revelation, and then as I read from the Book of Mormon, the translator is told by the ancient prophets that he could share the knowledge of these plates with those who would assist to bring forth the work. So there are 2 places in the Book of Mormon that promise that there may be witnesses. And so this was in the background. But I have to ask a more specific question. How did the 3 witnesses learn that they were the ones selected for this privilege? Well, as the Book of Mormon translation began to be nearing completion, then they came upon one of these verses that made so vivid the promise that there would be 3 witnesses, and Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer came to Joseph Smith and said, we are the ones. We want you to ask the Lord, can we see this great vision and have this experience that we may be the witnesses of the Book of Mormon of this generation? And Joseph Smith said they became persistent. In fact, he used the word teased, and he inquired of the Lord. And the revelation came, which is our present D&C Doctrine and Covenants 17. And though this is about only 6 verses, it's a remarkable revelation because it is so specific in what they would see. There are those even today who persist in saying, well, they had a subjective experience. But the very first verse of this Revelation said, "Behold, I say unto you that you must rely upon my word, and if you do this with full purpose of heart, you will have a view of the plates." Now, that's a physical thing they're going to see. And also of the breastplate. This is part of the artifacts that the ancient prophets put into the hill to be found in the latter days. And the sword of Laban, it was a sacred object in their society. And the Urim and Thummim, which was the means of translating, and also the miraculous directors that in the Book of Mormon led the first colony to this location. They were described as a ball with actual spindles on them. So there are 5 physical objects that are promised in the Book of Mormon. This is not a subjective view. And then they are told that they will see, just as the Book of Mormon says, these plates by the power of God. And so the promise is very specific as these particular men came, said, "Can we be the ones?" And the revelation from the Lord said, "This is so." I've often thought, as an aside, that Joseph Smith was in a terrible position if he was somehow putting people on. How could he produce a revelation? How could he produce 5 ancient objects? How could he satisfy that anybody that the power of God was really there? I mean, you do not counterfeit the power of God. You do not counterfeit ancient objects. And so here is the breathless anticipation that these will happen, which leads to this thing will happen, which leads to the next question. How is the promise of the revelation carried out? Now I'm going to paraphrase what Joseph Smith's mother says. And I love her history because she was a woman in the wings, and she observed very, very carefully and gives so much color and detail of what was going on. And so Joseph Smith's mother said at the Whitmer home they had a family devotional, a prayer, some hymns, and she said Joseph Smith stood up in the midst of that family devotional and walked over to Martin Harris and said, "Martin, it's the will of the Lord that you should see the plates the Book of Mormon is translated from, if you will humble yourself this day." Now, I have to be kind to Martin Harris the older I get, because he's an older individual, and the longer you live, the more skeptical you become, simply because you have seen many people deceived. And Martin Harris really did have a struggle with faith, more so than the other 2 witnesses, who were younger men of the age of Joseph Smith. They were all in the 23, 24-year bracket at this time. But Martin Harris was about 46. And so Martin Harris was singled out as having a special problem with faith. But as they left the house that morning to go into the woods near the Whitmer home, then Lucy Smith said she waited in the house until late afternoon. And in the late afternoon, she said, these men burst into the house just filled with joy and enthusiasm. And Joseph Smith threw himself beside her on the bed and said, "Mother, you don't know how relieved I am, because others have seen the plates, and the world knows that I am not just going about to deceive." And they themselves told what went on in those woods. More than anybody else, Joseph Smith gives that detail, which is backed up in the interviews with the witnesses, just spontaneously, little bits and pieces of an experience that's remarkable. And Joseph Smith put it together when he dictated his history. He said that we prayed and nothing happened. And finally Martin Harris said, "I'm the problem. I do lack faith, and I need to separate myself from you." And he said Martin Harris did so, went off by himself to pray, and soon as the prayers were reiterated, then Martin Harris, or without Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer and Joseph Smith saw a light materialize in midday at this June 1829 experience, early summer. And they said this light was brighter than the sun. It was more intense. And David Whitmer later said, but it was a soft light. And he said, and I'm going to read a quote where he said it extended way around. And so in the midst of that light, then the angel appeared. And the angel had plates. Joseph Smith doesn't give the detail that David Whitmer does later, but the angel showed them the plates and turned the leaves. And they heard the angel speak to David Whitmer, the one witness who did not come back to the church, saying, "David, blessed is the Lord, and he that keeps his commandments." And then they heard the voice of God, and Joseph Smith reported it exactly as the witnesses remembered it. And Joseph Smith said that voice of God said, "These plates are revealed by the power of God and translated by the power of God. The translation which you have is correct, and I command you to bear record of these things." As the vision closed, Joseph Smith said, "I went and found Martin Harris, and we knelt, and he said those same things were repeated to us." And then the witnesses returned to the house as Lucy Smith described. My next question is, how did the 8 witnesses see the plates? And the answer is they saw the same thing the 3 witnesses did as far as the physical object. Lucy Smith says in a few days the company came from Fayette 30 miles away to Palmyra. And the Smith home was in Manchester, south of Palmyra, in the country. And she said they went out into the woods, and the plates had been deposited there by the angel, and on a stump. The 8 witnesses picked these plates up, and their testimony said, we've seen them. We've examined the curious characters. Curious does not mean strange in that day, because curious meant that those characters were done with care. They were very carefully crafted. And so they examined the plates, and then they lifted them. They used the word heft, which is archaic for our day, but they were farmers, they were artisans. Some of them became shoemakers, some of them became tailors, and they examined physical things, and they examined the plates and bore testimony in their formal statement that they had lifted. They described that physical object, the plates, which you can see in the visual, as approximately 8 inches long, perhaps 6 inches thick, perhaps 5 or 6 inches wide, perhaps 5 or 6 inches thick. So you get various descriptions, 7 by 5 by 4, or as I've said, 8 by 6 by 5. And the descriptions are very consistent because they're estimating. They didn't take a measure. But all of the witnesses tell the same thing, and not only did they see the leaves and the characters that they could turn over, but they reported a sealed part, which you see on that visual of the book. And they report that the rings were shaped in a D shape with a perpendicular center running through the plates like a loose-leaf notebook, but then the ring going in a curvature, a half circle on the back side. So you definitely have a consistency in what they saw. The next question is, are the later lives of the witnesses consistent with their testimonies? And the answer is absolutely. But you need to ask, and I need to ask that question individually, because their lives went in different directions, and therefore the question is, what did they experience? How did they support their testimonies? I'm going to start with Martin Harris and ask the question, assuming that we know now that he's older, and ask what did the community think of him. Actually, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery was a young school teacher. Not too many people paid attention to him. And David Whitmer was a young farmer. He was not really very visible. But Martin Harris was visible. And as you take his situation in life, he had a large farm, multiple acres, perhaps a total of around 300 or 400. And that farm was a matter of business through the whole community. They knew who he was. They knew his reputation. And the community says 2 things about Martin Harris. The people who talked to him accused him of being fanatic because he believed in the Bible. That's, to me, a strange fact, but I think that is true even in our own culture. We tend to look at people who are secular as pleasing. They don't really ruffle our feathers in any way. And Martin Harris really did believe that God would do a great work in the latter days. He read the prophecies in the Bible about that, and so sometimes he's accused of being either religious or religiously overdone. But he was a believer. Next, they say Martin Harris is honest. Every one of the individuals in Palmyra that comment on this say he was an extremely honest individual. In fact, one of the people who set the type for the Book of Mormon, Pomeroy Tucker, later wrote a book about the early Mormons in the community and said that was a very puzzling thing to him. How could Martin Harris, who was such an honest man and an intelligent man, say that he had seen an angel on plates? Well, believe Martin Harris, it really happened. I'm reading now from a small book which, where I put a number of quotes on the book of, on the witnesses of the Book of Mormon. It's called Investigating the Book of Mormon Witnesses. And this quote comes from one of the man in Palmyra that should have known more about Martin Harris' business dealings than anyone else. He was the printer of the Book of Mormon. And this individual was was Mr. Grandin. And Grandin had been paid off $3,000 for the translation of the Book of Mormon. And then Martin Harris, 6 months after the Book of Mormon was translated, sometime quite a few months after the Book of Mormon is translated, is moving out of the community. And Grandin publishes his opinion of Harris for the community to read. It's almost like a funeral, because he says Mr. Harris was among the early settlers of this town and has ever borne the character of an honorable and upright man and an obliging and benevolent neighbor. He had secured to himself by honest industry a respectable fortune, and he has left a large circle of acquaintances and friends to pity his delusion. Tell something of Martin Harris's life. As we see a chart that outlines the birth of Martin Harris, 1783, which meant that he was middle-aged when he became a Book of Mormon witness, and then became the scribe for the Book of Mormon, as we said, in 1828, and mortgaged his farm to pay for the Book of Mormon in 1829. And then in early 1831, he moved with the Latter-day Saints who were faithful to Upper Ohio. And there he continued to contribute to the success of the restoration of the gospel in Kirtland, Ohio. Was extremely faithful for a time, but every one of the witnesses in the year 1837 and the beginning of the year 1838 became disenchanted with the policies of the church, and they were excommunicated from the church because they simply were not in harmony with church leadership. You said Martin Harris left the church. Doesn't this throw doubt on his testimony? No, the opposite is true. Peter and Paul had both seen visions, and yet they sharply disagreed at times on policy. The witnesses disagreed with the policies of Joseph Smith and never once threw doubt upon their testimonies. Had they not really seen the plates, when they were out of the church, they would have been silent. They would have disavowed themselves from the experience, and they would not have tried to keep ties with the church. All three witnesses left the church for a time, and two came back before death to make their peace with God and continued to bear testimony to the end. Give an example of Martin Harris's testimony. When Martin Harris was older, just before his rebaptism in 1870, a relative through marriage came through Kirtland and went to Martin Harris's house, and Martin Harris volunteered to take him, as he did many people, through the Kirtland Temple. And Martin Harris was asked in the Kirtland Temple, expressing some fairly bitter ideas toward some of the Latter-day Saints in Utah, and even the leadership of the church feeling jealous, saying, "I should have been president of the church." Then this individual, William H. Homer, asked Martin Harris, "Do you still believe in the Book of Mormon?" And Martin Harris, standing in the Kirtland Temple on a bright winter day, pointed to one of the arched Gothic windows, and the sun was streaming through the window, and he said, "Young man, do you see that sun streaming through the window? Just as surely as I see that sun, I saw the angel and the plates of the Book of Mormon." Martin Harris later came to Utah spent the last 5 years of his life as a very old but very articulate man. And when people in his community in Upper Cache Valley asked him about the plates of the Book of Mormon, he really featured physical things, like that sun illustration. One time he raised his hand and said, "Do you see my hand? Are my eyes playing tricks on me? Am I deceived?" He said, "No, I really see it. I really saw the angel and the plates." And Martin Harris, like all the witnesses, was especially concerned at the end of his life that people would listen to him and repeat the testimony. He often said, "I not only want you to hear my testimony, I want you to tell others what I've seen." Tell something about the life of Oliver Cowdery. If we look at a chart of Oliver Cowdery's life, we see that he was born in 1806, about a year after Joseph Smith was born. And after he became the scribe to the Book of Mormon, in later life he said that these were days never to be forgotten, to sit under the sound of the voice of the prophet and feel the Spirit of the Lord. Oliver Cowdery always remembered the spirituality of that occasion. The first thing he did in New York after the church was organized, of real significance, was to lead a mission west to Kirtland, where he and 4 other missionaries converted about 100 people within a few weeks' time. I'm going to read a record of a Shaker, an individual in a Shaker community who was a very vigorous leader, and he did not believe in the testimony of Oliver Cowdery, but this is his candid impression, a verbal, candid shot of Oliver Cowdery coming into his community. He said Oliver Cowdery stated that he had been one who had assisted in the translation of the Golden Bible and had seen the angel, and also had been commissioned by him to go out and bear testimony that God would destroy this generation. By request, we gave liberty for him to bear testimony in our meetings. He appeared meek and mild, and that characteristic of Cowdery is so reflected in other sources, that he was a man of powerful witness, but he was a man of great personal humility. I'm going to pick up a book now which I own, published about 1880, from an individual named P.W. Lang. It's the history of Seneca County, Ohio. After Oliver Cowdery was excommunicated in Kirtland, or excommunicated in Missouri, he returned to Ohio and retooled and became an attorney. And for 10 years, when he was outside of the church, he was very active in all of the community circles that an attorney would have been in those days. And this individual, P.W. Lang, apprenticed in Oliver Cowdery's office. And he wrote this very candid description of Oliver Cowdery after being tutored by him in law for 2 years. Mr. Cowdery was an able lawyer and a great advocate. He was polite, dignified, yet courteous. With all his kind and friendly disposition, there was a certain degree of sadness that seemed to pervade his own whole being. His association with others was marked with a great amount of information, and his conversation conveyed the beauty of his musical voice. His addresses to the court were brilliant and of great force. He was modest and reserved, never spoke ill of anyone. And then Lang adds, and Lang became a very prominent attorney in this community later, the writer read law with Mr. Cowdery in Tiffin and was intimately acquainted with him from the time he came here until he left, which afforded me every opportunity to study and love his noble and true manhood. So Oliver Cowdery was a person respected within and out of the church wherever he was. Later in life, Oliver returned to the church, and as he came back to the church in 1848, he stood in the church conference in Canesville, Iowa, winter quarters, or rather Council Bluffs we call it in church history at that time, and he said that Sidney Rigdon, as was popularly said then, he said Sidney Rigdon did not write the Book of Mormon. He said, "I wrote the Book of Mormon myself as it fell from the lips of Joseph Smith." And he said, "I beheld with my eyes and handled with my hands the gold plates from which it was translated. I also beheld the interpreter's statement fulfilling D&C 17 that the witnesses would not only see the plates but the other sacred objects. Now I'm going to ask the question about David Whitmer, and we should tell something about his life. If we see our chart on David Whitmer, we see that he was born about a year before Joseph Smith. Joseph was born later in the year 1805 and David in the beginning. And David, after becoming a witness, then joined with his family to sell their rather well-to-do farm holdings in Seneca County, New York. And they moved, staying shortly at Ohio, and then moved quickly to Jackson County, Missouri, which then became a tragedy for them and about 3,000 other Latter-day Saints, because they were forced out of Jackson County at gunpoint. And David was a strong personality, very visible in helping to defend and protect the Mormon community. Then he was appointed president of the church in Missouri. And Joseph Smith had a great deal of confidence in him. But in 1838, the tragedy of David, with a certain amount of, I would say, self-will in his personality, disagreed with Joseph Smith and was excommunicated. But David Whitmer stayed in Richmond, Missouri for 50 years and became the most interviewed of all the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, because he lived longer than any one of the 11 witnesses. And in some ways, you may see David as a valedictorian of the witnesses, because he summed up their testimony and was a man of absolutely irreproachable honesty and character. He parlayed a investment of a team and a wagon into a whole livery business and became a prominent a businessman, providing transportation and rentals of hacks and even funeral transportation in Richmond, Missouri. But I want to show you a symptom of his prominence, because I'm holding up an atlas in facsimile of 1877 from Ray County, Missouri. And this historical atlas pictured 20 individuals who were prominent in the community. From one point of view, they had to be prominent. From another point of view, they probably had to have enough money to contribute to the picture. But David Whitmer is pictured on this page, slightly rearranged by the editor of the reprint, with his nephew, David P. Whitmer, underneath him. David P. Whitmer is the son of Jacob, one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, and was named after David. And to the left of David Whitmer on the top line is Alexander Donovan, who was one time lawyer for Joseph Smith, who actually saved his life by refusing to execute an order of a court-martial. And so the community reputation of David is just overwhelmingly strong. Everybody respected him. And time and again, people interviewed him, came into the community, Mormon and non-member, Mormon and non-Mormon, and David Whitmer insisted that he had seen. Let me just give you the flavor of two interviews with David Whitmer. First of all, Orson Pratt, who had known David Whitmer as a fellow leader of the church before David Whitmer left the church, he came back as an old man and came with Joseph F. Smith, who was then a young apostle. Joseph F. Smith, who became president of the Latter-day Saint Church from 1900 approximately to 1918. And as these two men interviewed David Whitmer, Joseph F. Smith wrote down what David said. And this is David's description. We not only saw the plates of the Book of Mormon, but also the brass plates, the plates of the Book of Ether, the plates containing the record of the witness and of the wickedness and secret combinations of the people of the world. The fact is, it was just as though Oliver and Joseph and I were sitting here on a log when we were overshadowed by a light. It was not like the light of the sun, but more glorious and beautiful. It extended away around us. We saw many records besides the plates, also the sword of Laban, the directors, and the interpreters. I saw them just as plain as I see this bed, striking the bed beside him with his hand. And I heard the voice of God as distinctly as I ever heard anything in my life. declaring that the records of the plates of the Book of Mormon were translated by the gift and power of God. My favorite interview with David Whitmer comes from a man who was coming right out of law school, who later became very prominent in Utah as a political leader. His name is James Henry Moyle, who was the father, as a matter of fact, of a man who became one of the presidents of the church, a counselor to President McKay, Henry D. Moyle. And James Henry Moyle stopped from his law school training in Michigan, coming back to Utah to see David Whitmer. And he said he was a young man and he wanted to be certain that David Whitmer had been telling the truth. He wanted to examine him and see what kind of a man he was. The quality of Moyle is very great as I read his biography done by Gordon B. Hinckley when he was a young neighbor of James H. Moyle. He lived in the Cottonwood area in Salt Lake City and knew Moyle well and wrote his biography. Moyle became one of the very first Latter-day Saints to succeed in national politics because although he had been unsuccessful as a senatorial and governor candidate here in Utah, he was rewarded by his party with the post of being undersecretary of an undersecretary in the cabinet in Washington, D.C. And then he was later appointed for 8 years as director of customs in New York City. And when James H. Moyle died, he had long obituaries in Eastern papers, including the New York Times, which commented on the fact that he was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under two administrations, the Wilson and the Roosevelt administrations. He was a very close friend of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And so I'm just pointing that out because Moyle is a singularly candid, intelligent, and honest individual all through his life. And later when he talked about David Whitmer and the interview in a talk in Salt Lake City, he said that he wondered if it was possible that David Whitmer might have been deceived. And he said, I induced him to relate to me under such cross-examination as I was able to give every detail of what took place. He described minutely the spot in the woods, the large log that separated him from the angel, and that he saw the plates, and that he did hear the voice of God. I asked him if there was any possibility for him to have been deceived, and that it was all a mistake. He said, no. I asked him then why he left the church, and he talked about the policies that differentiated him from Joseph Smith. But he said he knew that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, and through him had been restored the gospel of Christ in these latter days. To me, this was a wonderful testimony. Did the 8 witnesses also maintain their testimony to the end, as did the 3? Yes. David Whitmer quoted both the 3 and the 8 in a pamphlet that I'm holding up, published a year before his death in 1887. And in this pamphlet, an address to all believers in Christ, David Whitmer tried to put his message and his own feelings about the Book of Mormon in such a way that they would be available to everybody. And toward the beginning, he observes that 2 encyclopedias had quoted him as having denied his testimony, and this is what he said about the 3, and I'm quoting his words, I will say once more to all mankind that I have never at any time denied that testimony or any part thereof. I also testify to the world that neither Oliver Cowdery nor Martin Harris ever at any time denied their testimony. They both died reaffirming the truth of the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon. I was present at the deathbed of Oliver Cowdery, and his last words were, Brother David, be true to your testimony to the Book of Mormon. Now David went on to talk about the 11 witnesses also as having, the 8 witnesses also as having never denied their testimony. How important is it to believe the witnesses of the Book of Mormon? My counter question is, how important is it to believe the testimony of Peter and Paul that they had seen Christ in the resurrection? Paul said you can set aside our testimony. That's a famous chapter, 1 Corinthians 15. He said, you may do that, but you have essentially made us into liars, but we're not liars. We're honest men, and we're telling the truth. I have been in every county where the witnesses lived, read the newspapers of their time, seen the court records, and I know they were honest men, but they were men with a divine mission. When Jesus sent apostles out, he gave them instructions, Matthew 10, and he sent 70s out on missions and gave them instructions, Luke 10. And in both cases, he said this to them, he that receiveth you receiveth me, and he that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me. The witnesses are God's modern servants. With Joseph Smith, whose picture you see, they support the reality of the plates and the truth of the Book of Mormon. God's voice said it was translated correctly. So I would appeal to everybody who listens. Can we read the Book of Mormon knowing it is a divine record, understand its truth, and apply its principles? And I also pray that we would understand the divinity of Joseph Smith's mission, the restoration of the gospel, because the Book of Mormon is a part of that great process of restoring God's kingdom in the latter days. This is the message of God's law of witnesses for us today.